Hi everyone, and welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together. Evolution, it's always been a hot button issue, and as our science has progressed, the question starts to be asked, is evolution something that's being more and more solidified by the evidence? Is it being proven, or is it perhaps something that is becoming more tenuous, on shakier ground? Well, today I'm excited to bring an expert on paleontology, on evolutionary theory, to you in our interview today. Dr. Günter Bechly is an evolutionary biologist, actually studies insects, and a paleontologist who's devoted much of his life to this effort. And he says that the problems of the modern Neo-darwinian synthesis are really becoming more and more difficult to overcome. I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Beckley as we begin this next Come Let Us Reason Together. Okay, everyone. Again, as I say, my name is Lenny Esposito, and I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Günter Bechly. He is a German paleoentomologist who specializes in fossil history and systematics of insects. And I guess your specialty was in dragonflies, the most diverse group of animals, really, if you think about it, in the categories of animals on the planet. Now, he served as curator for amber and fossil insects in the Department of Paleontology at the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, Germany, and he's also a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Dr. Beckley earned his PhD in geosciences from Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen, Germany. So, Dr. Beckley, welcome to our show, and I'm glad to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, it's quite a resume that you have here, quite a CV. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of your background? What got you interested in the sciences? And you started off, you were a self-described atheist up until your 40s, as I understand. Is that correct?
That's right. That's of course a story that you often hear, and where a lot of skeptics get even more skeptical when they hear, oh, he was an atheist, or claims he was an atheist. But I really was an atheist and materialist, as you said, until my 40s. And then became interested in modern physics. I'm a biologist, but I became interested on a popular science level in modern physics, and studied books like by Brian Greene and others, Richard Feynman and so on, and encountered a lot of problems where I never thought about before, like where do the laws of nature come from? How do you get this relationship of mathematics and the laws of nature between math and science? And what is causality, and what is the nature of time, and so on. And this brought me on a kind of intellectual journey that ultimately led me away from materialism, and finally also led me away from atheism. So that is one part of my personal background. The other is the science part. So I was interested in nature, and especially in animals and in insects from early childhood on, and then later studied biology and paleontology, and worked for 16 years as a curator for amber and fossil insects at the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, Germany, which is one of the 5 big natural history museums in Germany. And I just did regular evolutionary science. So from training, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and studied the fossil history and evolution of insects. And most of the time didn't have any problems with the theory of evolution, because I didn't really think too deeply about potential problems. I just took it as a given, as you are trained at school and at university, and you just work on your everyday problems without questioning the underlying paradigm or looking for fundamental problems of the whole approach. And then in the year 2009, I was responsible at this museum for organizing the largest exhibition in Germany for the Darwin year, which was this double celebration of Darwin's 200th birthday and the 150th anniversary of the publication of his Origin of Species. And for this exhibition, I had to organize different modules which introduced the theory and the personal history of Darwin and his voyage and the evidence for evolution. And we also wanted to address modern critics of evolution and, of course, refute them. So we wanted to address creationists and intelligent design proponents. And so I organized different modules on this subject, and one required me to buy books of Darwin critics, of intelligent design proponents, because I had this idea to make a wooden balance where you had a big pile of books of Darwin opponents on one side and the two main works by Darwin on the other side, and the balance would go down, of course, on Darwin's side because he has the heavy-weighted arguments. And so I had to buy these books on Amazon. I was not only responsible for this exhibition in terms of designing it, but also for the whole practical organization and the kind of logistics. And so I acquired these books via Amazon, had them sitting in my office for a while prior to the opening of the exhibition. And sooner or later, I thought, let's have a look into this, into these books, just to be a little bit prepared if there should be
kind of like oh, I have to take the medicine. It's gonna be terrible to swallow, but I guess I'll do it, right?
Right.
Okay, so continue.
Yes, so I took a look at these books to just be prepared in the case that there should be questions by Darwin opponents during the exhibition, and I thought, well, it should be easy to refute these arguments. It's probably all based on biblical fundamentalism and shallow arguments and not really on hard science. And when I then looked into these books, I was quite surprised that the arguments were much deeper than I expected, much more scientific, not based on religious argumentation, but based on math and on empirical evidence. And the more I looked into these arguments, the more I became convinced that these Darwin critics from the intelligent design movement are misrepresented by the mainstream scientists. The arguments are usually strawmanned and ridiculed and not presented in their real depth and in their hardest version. And so more and more I became a skeptic of Neo-Darwinism myself and an intelligent design proponent myself. And I mostly kept this as a kind of private interest and private intellectual endeavor, but I didn't really go to my colleagues and tell them, because of course this is a career risk. But together with my also changing worldview, and this has nothing to do with evolution. I'm now a Christian and moved from atheism to theism and ultimately a kind of Christianity. But this has nothing to do with my critique of Darwinism. So I still believe in an old Earth. I still believe in common descent. I have no problem to have a ape-like creature or even a lobe-finned fish or a single-celled organism in my personal ancestral lineage. My problems with Neo-Darwinism were based on empirical problems and scientific problems that I encountered and that I found to have merit and that really question the causal adequacy of this Darwinian process of mere natural selection working on random mutations and other similar mechanistic processes. But of course, when I changed my worldview, then I had a different view also on this question: should I be outspoken about my critique on Neo-Darwinism? So I then decided in 2015, 2016 to go public and made a website where I had a kind of coming out as an intelligent design proponent. And this quickly led to a kind of counter reaction by my colleagues and by the scientific establishment, which then made within a few months work at the museum where I worked basically impossible. So I couldn't get any cooperations anymore, didn't get grant money anymore to do travels or to acquire fossils. And so ultimately, after a year, I had to make a decision and decided to leave the museum. I was, let's say, friendly asked if I would leave, because I was directly told that I was no longer welcome and that I was considered to be a risk for the reputation of the institution. And since productive work was not possible anymore, I left the museum then late in 2016, and then had to look for other options to really be able to say what I think, but also continue to work in the field that interests me, which is the history of life and paleontology and biology. And so I ended up at Discovery Institute and Biologic Institute, where I got the opportunity to work on the history of life from an intelligent design perspective, which, of course, is very refreshing when you have this possibility to really say what you think without having without being afraid that it has career consequences.
Well, it's very interesting. There's so many people within the general public today who assume that just because we're talking science, it's dispassionate, it's non-biased, it's follow the evidence wherever it leads. And your story shows that it can be actually quite the opposite. I think Dr. Richard Sternberg, he didn't even go as far as you. All he did was allow an intelligent design paper to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And here's Dr. Sternberg, for those who don't know, was the head of the Smithsonian Museum of Anthropology and Paleontology, and the Natural History Museum. And he's an expert, evolutionary expert in his own right. And he was ousted at the same time. But the funny thing is, it becomes a catch-22. People dismiss intelligent design because, where's all the peer review articles? But you can't put out any peer review articles because automatically you get shunned. And you start to say, well, what are you so afraid of there? So
that's exactly right, and I can confirm this from personal experience that I got mainstream articles that did nothing else than propose, let's say, a new species of fossil insect without any relation to intelligent design, rejected by reviewers because I had as affiliation Biologic Institute, which is related to Discovery Institute. And recently, I have, together with co-authors, submitted an article on this waiting time problem, which is now in preparation for the third journal to be submitted. Two journals rejected the article, not because the reviewer said it's bad science, but because they didn't even bother to send it to reviewers. They noticed, okay, these authors are some of these blacklisted evil intelligent design creationists, and so this cannot be real science and we don't have to bother reviewers. And it's really difficult to get this stuff into mainstream journals. Sometimes it's possible if you have lucky circumstances, lucky combination of an editor who's open-minded, have reviewers who are open-minded, and then it can happen. But it's far from being, let's say, unbiased scientific community in an unbiased search for truth. It's something that I believe when I studied as well, but I had to learn otherwise.
Exactly. Well, and if you've ever read Thomas Kuhn, he does a very good job, I think, of expressing this, and no one talks about that. But that's a issue for another program, I think. Let's first of all, before we go too far into it, let's make distinctions here. There's a distinction between the classical Darwinian understanding and the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, the Evo-Devo and things like that. Can you define those for me and tell me what's common throughout that thread and where Darwinism is today versus when Charles Darwin offered it?
So first thing, maybe Darwin wasn't the first to come up with this idea of evolution. This idea goes back even to the ancient Greeks. And there were other scientists before him, like Lamarck, for example, or like his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who had these evolutionary ideas. This was floating around in the scientific establishment at this time. What was typical for Darwin, or what was characteristic for his theories, that he had this idea together with Wallace, independently of Wallace, about a mechanism that could maybe explain how simple beginnings could lead to complex outcomes. And this is this mechanism, this kind of filter mechanism where you have random variation and natural selection. But Darwin had no idea about the hereditary mechanisms of genetics, and that was simply a black box for him. So classical Darwinism would be this idea, not just common descent, but common descent together with natural selection acting on random variations. Neo-Darwinism then and the modern synthesis came up when genetics was discovered, and you had also DNA discovered, and you had this whole mechanism of mutations basically described, and you could really describe the mechanism that is underlying these genetic variations that Darwin more or less postulated or assumed based on experiences from breeding pigeons or domestic animals. And so this led to the Neo-Darwinian modern synthesis, which is the combination of genetics, population genetics, and Darwin's ideas. And then, of course, you have now something that is called the extended synthesis, which is a kind of movement that is becoming more and more popular, more and more mainstream, which realizes that Neo-Darwinism has massive problems, and that tries to supplement now the Neo-Darwinian modern synthesis with additional mechanisms like evo-devo or niche construction or natural genetic engineering and evolvability and stuff like that. And they try to find other non-guided, mechanistic, blind mechanisms that maybe could fill these gaps or these problems of Neo-Darwinism. But until now, they haven't succeeded to really address the big problems of Neo-Darwinism or offer an alternative that plausibly explains the explanatory deficits.
Okay, yeah. So traditionally, in both of those views, or the common understanding, even of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis and such, there's an evolutionary tree of life where you start with a single trunk. And as the organism gets more complex, it starts branching out, and then you get the different phyla and things of that nature. And we'll put up a graphic here so you could kind of see what that is. But as you say, those trees are starting to become really problematic to trace. And as a paleontologist, the fossil record is really one way we can look at these things. Darwin had very little to deal with in his day. We have a whole lot more now. He was hoping that as they discovered more, it would make the whole thing more clear, but it sounds like it's not. It's actually going in the other direction. Now, you studied insects, entomology. So I think this is fascinating because you don't see a whole lot of evolutionary trees for insect development. You see a lot for dinosaurs and things like that. But yeah. Tell me where these problems are in the fossil record. Of course, we have the Cambrian explosion, which is a big one, but you say that that's not the only one. So can you?
Oh, definitely not. So just to address this thing that you said about the evolutionary trees of insects, there are thousands of evolutionary trees of insects. It's just not so popular like dinosaurs. You don't see them in the mainstream popular press. But in the technical literature, basically for every group, you have publications about their assumed evolutionary history and phylogeny, and with trees and evolutionary scenarios and so on. And there's also quite a good fossil record of insects, which reaches back 320 million years into the Carboniferous and leads till almost modern times. And you have 10,000s of fossil insects that document the fossil history. What this fossil record shows is, of course, as in basically all groups and for all major transitions in the history of life is that there is no evidence for a gradual development where you have long periods of time available for an accumulation of small changes that then build up into large re-engineerings of body plans, like getting from flightless insects to winged insects. So in one of the main textbooks on insect evolution by Grimaldi and Engel, the author said there is nothing like an Archaeopteryx for insects, which would show the transition from wingless insect to winged insect. And that is true for most groups on most taxonomical levels. Even if you go, let's say, to a group like butterflies, you mostly find the fossils on the end branches of the trees, but you find no fossils or only very few and very controversial fossils for the, let's say, connecting points of the trees. So the fossil record is not really very good support for, let's say, Darwin's tree of life, but I still think there is reasonable evidence for this theory of common descent. It would not be true to say, well, that's just made up nonsense, or I think it's an elegant explanation for the, let's say, total evidence. If you take everything together, genetics and fossil record and biogeography, then common descent definitely makes sense. The problem is that what Darwin's process that he postulated requires, and this is independent if it's classical Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism or extended synthesis, is as soon as you have a kind of blind search process, it can only work if you have small changes accumulating over long periods of time. That's why even Richard Dawkins emphasized this kind of gradualism, said, if this process was not gradual, then it failed as an explanation. And he had this example of climbing Mount Improbable and said, imagine you sit at the coast with this cliff and you want to reach the top of the cliff, but jumping with one jump from the bottom to the top of the cliff is impossible, basically. But on the backside of the mountain, there's a gentle slope, and there you can walk step by step to the top of the cliff. And every step is easy to do, but together they make this apparently miraculous jump to the top of the cliff. But this presupposes that you have this gentle cliff, which would translate in evolution to long periods of time, and you have all these small steps accumulating, which would be all small mutations that then add up to big changes in terms of body plan and morphology, and new genes and new proteins, new tissues, new organs, and so on. And the fossil record doesn't document this, and it's now sufficiently complete on the major levels. Of course, the fossil record will always be incomplete on the lowest level, of the species level, because just a fraction of the species that ever lived fossilized. But when we compare, let's say, how many of mammal families that live now are represented in the fossil record, and we can do this with all kinds of organisms, we have a reasonable estimate that on the higher taxonomical levels that are relevant for macroevolution, we have a very complete fossil record, and the gaps that are still there, and they are everywhere. It's an ubiquitous pattern in the fossil record that you have these discontinuities and these sudden appearances of new body plans in all groups of organisms, in all periods of Earth history, in all geographical regions. That this simply doesn't resonate with Darwin's proposed mechanism or any other unguided.
Darwin had a famous, kind of debate, skirmish with Stephen Jay Gould and the whole concept of punctuated equilibria, which of the two, you do have the gradual view is much more problematic, not only in terms of the fossil record, but even in terms of the amount of change that happens over time. So, for example, I talked about Richard Sternberg, who's done work on Pakicetus in Wales. You have like a 10, 11 million year time frame between what this land animal, hippo kind of bovine kind of creature is that turns into a fully aquatic mammal. And 11 million years, given the number of body plan changes, you have to pull the reproductive system inside. You've got to move the breathing apparatus to the top of the head, and you got to be able to filter out salt water, and you've got to give birth underwater, and you've got to still maintain warm blood. There's just so many pieces. How do you do that in 11 million years and still say that it's common gradual change?
It's even worse. That's one of the projects I'm currently working on, is this waiting time problem for the example of whale origins. And I'm working on this together with Richard Sternberg and some other colleagues. And the problem has even got worse. Now the window of time available is no longer 11 million years. It's only 4.5
Okay, I hadn't
years.
heard that.
And just to give an illustration how short this is, because of course in human terms this still sounds like a lot of time. If we look at human history, you could say, well, 4.5 million years is a lot of time. But in biological terms or in paleontological terms, 4.5 million years is, according to mainstream evolutionary biologists, is the average lifespan of a larger mammal species from its origin till its either extinction or dissolution. So this whole reconstruction from an animal that looked basically like a pig, like Pachycetus, to something that already looked like a kind of dolphin or real whale, like Basilosaurus or Dorudon, this happened within the lifespan of a single species, which is ridiculous. Even if you have different branching events and different speciation events in this time, which are nested maybe over this time span. But it shows how short this time is in biological terms to make this major re-engineering of the body plan. And what also people tend to underestimate in evolutionary biology, if they are not also looking into the Evo-Devo background of the characters, is that even apparently simple features, for example, in whales, you have this reduction of the hind legs that then disappear. And in modern whales, you rarely find this kind of atavism where small remnants of these hind limbs can reappear as a kind of reactivation, as it is said, from these silenced genes. But if you look at the Evo-Devo, and there have been experiments on this reduction of hind limbs, it requires many mutations. It requires coordinated mutations, which have to come together to have an adaptive effect, to be, let's say, visible to selection. Every mutation for itself is neutral, and selection is blind to these mutations. So this raises this waiting time problem. And if you do the math and you just use the standard math of mainstream population genetics, you arrive at times that are orders of magnitude. And this means 10 times, 100 times, partly thousands of times longer than the available time spans, even based on the mainstream dating of these events and the mainstream evolutionary history and the fossil record and so on. So even if you take all these data for granted, then the time simply is not sufficient to accommodate these genetic changes.
And another factor that a lot of people don't realize is because these changes have to happen generationally. In other words, you have to, right? The whole point of Darwinism is he who leaves the most offspring leaves the most offspring. Some people have called it a tautology because that's really what random selection says, is that he who leaves the most offspring leaves the most offspring. But if you have animals, and I don't know what the lifespan of a dolphin is, but the larger the animal, usually the longer the lifespan, which means that the generational sequence happens very, very slowly. If you're talking about bacteria, you can study. I mean, Lenski and his E. coli experiments. It took him like 30 years with bacteria that replicate daily. They leave 1 million progeny every day, and it took him 30 years to see a slight evolutionary change. Now that's with a new generation, whereas with human beings, for example, it's a new generation every 20 years, and there's much fewer.
Yes.
So you have that problem dealing with as well. And you start coming into a number of these issues that nobody's talking about.
That's absolutely correct, and the generation times in whales are quite well known. So you can just Google the mainstream literature on cetaceans, and you find studies on the lifespan of baleen whales and of toothed whales and of dolphins and killer whales and so on. And you also have data, experimental data on the mutation rates of whales and other mammals. So all the parameters that you need to also population sizes, let's say prior to the whaling area, even if they are estimated, but there are very good estimates on the population size of different groups of whales prior to the whaling time. So we have all the data that are required to do the math and really look into the mathematical feasibility of this Neo-Darwinian approach to explain the origin of whales, and it doesn't work.
So you had mentioned Archaeopteryx. Usually that's always trotted out is you see dinosaurs turned into birds. We still have the dinosaurs with us. They're all birds now. How do you understand that response? And is that a true statement that we should be making?
Well, first thing is that there is a scientific dispute, even though it's a dispute, let's say, between David and Goliath. There is the majority of paleontologists, and I would rather tend into this direction, would say there is quite good anatomical evidence that you have this fuzzy region between bipedal theropod dinosaurs like Velociraptor or Microraptor, and early birds like Archaeopteryx and others that have been found in China. So I think there's a reasonable case to make this connection that birds are a kind of derived dinosaurs, which of course is a different question from how was this transition made? How did you get a feather from a scale or from a skin that had scales and where you had similar precursors, embryological precursors to make feathers. And that is one question. But there is also a minority, and this is mostly represented by an American paleontologist, Alan Fiducia, who doesn't believe at all that birds are dinosaurs and who has pointed out a lot of problems, anatomical problems from the fossil record, from the timing of the appearance of different groups, which are usually, let's say, put a little bit under the carpet by the mainstream paleontologist. And he says this could very well be rather the similarities, let's say, in the anatomy of the leg bones between these bipedal dinosaurs and birds that could be convergences and could be independently originated. And he thinks that birds have a very different origin from bipedal dinosaurs. And then, of course, the question is, what about these real feathered animals like Microraptor, which clearly have pennaceous feathers? And there are also other mainstream paleontologists who think that these animals actually are secondarily flightless birds, and that those that are looking like bipedal runners with shorter arms were derived from flying birds. There was a very recent study just a few weeks ago appearing on the pattern of flight feathers, and the scientists studied in hundreds of modern birds just the number of flight feathers on the wings, and they discovered that those that can fly have 11 to, I think it was 13 or 15 of the major primary flight feathers. And all those that are secondarily flightless have either none or more than 40. And then they looked at fossil groups, and they looked how many primary flight feathers do they have, and they found that those bipedal dinosaurs with pennaceous feathers have the number of flight feathers that is typical for flying birds, and that makes a quite good confirmation of this theory that they are secondarily flightless and not precursors that show how did a wing originate. Oh, they first flapped with their tiny
so it may be a devolutionary change, if you will.
A devolution, not an evolution. That is the same. You mentioned Lenski's long-term experiment with colibacteria. There's also the only thing that happened there, if you look at these tiny changes in terms of their physiology, that they were able to use citrate or to metabolize. If you look into the genetics of what happened there, it's usually there was a gene already there, and then it was broken and deteriorated, and this allowed a different pathway of metabolizing a different substance. It was not the originating of a new gene or new protein that would be required, let's say, to explain something like the Cambrian explosion, or how do you get a bird feather from no bird feather. So
that's interesting.
that is one of the points actually where I think there is strong empirical support that Darwinism is wrong, is that these long-term experiments which translate, if you compare the, as you said, these generation times and the population size, what this long-term experiment basically simulated is the whole evolution of mammals in terms of bacteria, but it's the same evolutionary resources that were available there in terms of generations and population size and mutations that could be played around, and nothing happened. But in mammals, you would have the origin of bats from mice-like organisms, or from whales from pig-like organisms, or primates from squirrel-like organisms. That shows there is something wrong. And the other point is computer simulation, which also totally failed to produce really significant amounts of specified information without smuggling it in through some backdoor. But otherwise, none of these simulations was able to break what Dembski called the universal probability bound, which he estimated to be about 500 bit. That would be 500 bit is possible within the probabilistic resources of our universe to generate with mechanistic random processes. Everything above 500 bit is basically impossible, and no computer program. And we have now computers that are able to play evolution that would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of years of real evolution in the history of life. And they can't produce the effect that should be produced by mutation and selection. So there's clearly a problem.
I mean, I can just imagine that in an alternate case scenario that somebody would stumble upon a platypus and say it was evolved from a bird. I mean, you could, you when you start with morphologic outer structures and then argue backwards, you're susceptible to this. So, and that's part of what we're trying to sort through.
Definitely, you can push everything, every kind of data you can make fit to some kind of evolutionary scenario if you add more ad hoc stories to it. But that is another problem which is now becoming more and more evident, is that you have these vast amount of conflicting data. If Darwinism is true, you should expect that different lines of data all converge to history of life, to one true tree of life. But actually, morphology conflicts with molecular data conflict with each other. They all produce different trees. And I'm currently working on a kind of visualization of this problem, where you show, if you take, let's say, some kind of group, if it's birds or certain groups of mammals, and you look just into the modern phylogenetic trees that have been published on them, let's say in the past 10 or 20 years. So not the very old stuff that is maybe obsolete because the methods were not sophisticated enough, just the modern stuff based on the most sophisticated comparative anatomy, the most sophisticated molecular and phylogenomic methods. And you look at the trees and you take all the published trees and you calculate a kind of common denominator, which is called a consensus tree. Those trees tend to collapse into a kind of polytomy, which shows this amount of conflicting data. And this also suggests that there's something wrong with this whole scenario. And that is something that recently made me not totally abandoning the thing of common descent. I think there's still reasonable evidence for it, but I think the evidence in favor of common descent is much weaker than it is often painted by hardcore Darwinists like Richard Dawkins, who said, well, that's a fact, and there is all the evidence, all the trees are agreeing with each other. That's nonsense. They are not agreeing at all. There's conflict everywhere. And this is also evident, also sometimes a little bit hidden in the supplementary information or in some obscure journals, but it's well known in the scientific community that you have this problem of conflicting data and that the trees do not agree.
So I have a little kind of acronym that I use when I'm talking with folks like this. I tell people I offer the lice problem of evolution. And what I say is, lice is these little parasites that once they get into your hair and they're completely contagious. They spread like wildfire, really hard to get rid of. And I said evolutionary theory is a lot like that. And here's the four main issues with the lice problem. First is the L, the leap to life. How do you go from non-living material to living material? There's just nothing. There's no good models at all that deal with that. So you have the leap to life. You have this injection of information. How do you come up with these new body plans and these new structures? Where does that information come from? Because it has to be programmed into the genes, as well as how the genes express that. And as we're learning more and more about what they called so-called junk DNA, gene expression is huge. And it seems to be that there's a whole lot more to the genetic code than we understand today. So then, of course, you have created complex, the idea that there are certain systems that are irreducibly complex. Michael Behe and the mousetrap example, how you can't evolve things like the flagellum, like the cascading sequence of immunity and things like that. And then the last one is the edge of evolution, the fact that you need certain amount of time, and evolution can only proceed with these. As you mentioned Bill Dembski's calculation about how quickly evolution. So you have LICE, leap to life, injection of information, created complex, and the edge of evolution. I said, until the evolution has solved their lice problem, everybody's going to be sitting around scratching their heads. So that's kind of how I try to tell folks about it. But I think that's
maybe you'll find a way to add an S to this acronym.
Okay.
Because one more thing that I find very convincing is what I would call the search space problem, and that would be the work by my colleague Douglas Axe on the question, how can proteins evolve? And what he found is that if you look at this combinatorial search space of all amino acid sequences, and you look at these very isolated and very fast separated islands of function where proteins that could have any kind of biological role are placed in this vast combinatorial search space. We do not have these kind of trajectories where you could jump from one island to the other, like crossing a river, jumping from one stone to the other, to get from one protein family to another protein family. You can vary around, let's say, one island, and you can make variations of a protein within a protein family, but to get from one protein family to another requires a kind of miracle-like change where hundreds of amino acids have to be changed in the correct way to have any kind of viable structure. Yeah. And that's what you need in Darwinism, of course, is you have to do not just need hypothetical transitional forms, you need hypothetical viable transitional forms that have they are not just viable, they should be advantageous. And that's not there. So even the origin of new proteins and everything in biology is made of proteins is basically refuted by these islands of function and which do not allow a gradual transition in a Darwinian way.
You have the problem of homochirality, where where you have equal bonding with the left-handed and right-handed acids and sugars and all that kind of thing. It's a pretty big issue. Okay, so
it's a mess.
So let's shift and talk about intelligent design. Specifically as a legitimate science. Now, what, in your understanding, makes something science? I mean, first of all, it's the term science. We throw the term around, that's not science, or the science will do it. What do we mean by science? What is science?
That's very easy. Judges at American courts decide what is science and what's not.
The Dover decision, yes.
was one of the most ridiculous jokes in modern history. That it's still used by atheists and by hardcore Darwinists to say, but Judge Jones said intelligent design is not science. And not even mainstream, most high-class philosophers of science agree on this kind of demarcation criterion, what qualifies as science and what distinguishes science from non-science. However you make the definitions, you either get too much into science and then suddenly homeopathy and astrology would become science, or you exclude too much and suddenly string theory is not science and Darwinism is not science if you have, let's say, very hard falsificationist criteria for science. Basically, this would only leave physics with experimental, mathematically, where you can make mathematical models and predictions and experiments. This would be left as science if you would use, let's say, strong Popperian criteria. So there is no really a agreed upon definition what is science and not, which makes it a little bit difficult to answer this question. Is something science? It depends how you define science. I personally would say science requires that you can rationally discuss the probability of hypothesis, and you can use empirical evidence to arrive at a method that is called an inference to the best explanation, which theory or which hypothesis best explains all of the evidence with the fewest ad hoc assumptions. That would be my, let's say, most general approach to science that would include historical sciences as well as empirical sciences, which of course is a difference. And Darwinism, or looking at what was the reason that dinosaurs went extinct, is a different question from how does gravity work. In the one case we can look and can make experiments, in the other case we have to infer based on circumstantial evidences. So these are different approaches, but I think if we use this kind of definition for science, then Darwinism would qualify as science, and you can look at the evidence and look, is the evidence meeting, is it resonating with the theory? And as we have discussed already, there are a lot of problems, and the fossil record doesn't resonate at all with this gradualist picture of Darwinism. And on the other hand, you have intelligent design theory. And there it is often said, well, but it's not science because it makes no predictions. Right. And this is the myth and a kind of propaganda myth, because it's not true, and it has been refuted so often. My friend and colleague Steve Meyer, in his book Signature of the Cell, has put a list of, I think it was a dozen of predictions that are made by intelligent design theory. Bill Dembski has made a very precise prediction with this universal probability bound. Just make a computer program that generates more than 500 bits of specified information without smuggling it in through the back door, and you have refuted a core prediction by intelligent design theory. I would say this could kill intelligent design theory if you could make a computer program that, by simply using these kind of Darwinian random changes and this filter process of selection to generate complex new information in terms of, let's say, digital information, in terms of getting from Microsoft Word to Mac Office or whatever, then you would have refuted intelligent design theory and made a very strong case for the feasibility of the Neo-Darwinian process. But of course, that's not what happened in real life. In real life, it happened that no computer simulation could achieve this yet. So I think intelligent design fulfills all criteria for science that would also include, let's say, Darwinism. And then you just have to look at the evidence and look what kind of evidence, also when you take this Bayesian approach, what would the theory predict to find, and which evidence rather fits with the predictions of the theory? Where are you more surprised to find? Is it more surprising based on intelligent design or Darwinism that different lines of evidence lead to different phylogenetic trees, or that the history of the fossil record shows abrupt transitions rather than gradual building up of body plans? And then you can make a simple inference to the best explanation, and this, I think, rather points to intelligent design as a scientific explanation.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with, let's say, invoking miracles or supernaturalism or saying God did it. Let's have a miracle here, as it is often showed in this kind of cartoonish version. And somebody says, oh, you should be a little bit more specific at this point where you invoke a miracle. No, that's not true. Intelligent design does not even require supernaturalism. And this is evident from the fact that what is now currently very popular, especially in circles of modern physicists, is the simulation hypothesis, that we are living in the matrix. And there are philosophers like Nick Bostrom, or people like Max Tegmark, or even Neil deGrasse Tyson, who play with this kind of idea. And there it's totally acceptable, because that would be, we would be living in the simulation made by our descendants or by aliens. And but it's a totally naturalistic approach, but it's an intelligent design approach. It would be, we would be living in a design program, and that would be the explanation why we have this fine-tuning of the universe and so on, and maybe even the origin of life, and this could all be explained with this kind of matrix hypothesis, but it has nothing to do with God or with supernaturalism. And you could have other, panspermia is another idea that was brought up by mainstream scientists, that life on Earth was seeded by aliens, and maybe even later in the history of life, aliens intervened. That would also be naturalistic, and you would just have to look at the evidence. And even Richard Dawkins, famously in this interview for the Ben Stein had with him, the Expelled movie, he admitted, well, maybe there could be, and I think he even used the word signature in the DNA or signature in the cell. There could be some signature in the genetic code that would point towards intelligent interference, and then aliens would have been responsible, would have to be responsible for this. So that, of course, is a very nice allusion to Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. There we have this kind of signature in the genetic code and in this information problem of the genetic code. And then, of course, you can ask the question, what is the most plausible explanation for intelligent design? And there, I think, then you transgress the method. As soon as you want to identify the designer, I think you need information and arguments outside the methodological apparatus of intelligent design theory, which is just design detection, which is totally uncontroversial in fields like forensics or the SETI project, or archaeology is a certain stone, was it made by Neanderthals as a stone tool, or is it a natural stone formation? This is what the method can do, is detect evidence for intelligent agency. If you want to identify the designer, you need additional arguments. And then, of course, worldview questions and metaphysical questions, philosophical arguments play a role. Other scientific arguments play a role. So, for example, if you look at evolution on Earth, then of course it could still be possible to invoke aliens. If you look into the fine-tuning of the universe, it's a little bit of a problem to invoke aliens, because aliens are inside the universe, and we have the fine-tuning already at the beginning, at the very initial conditions of the universe. So you would need an intelligent agent outside of the, at least of our space-time universe, to make this fine-tuning. So there you can have additional arguments that would rule out certain explanations of fine-tuning. This would still leave open the possibility for the matrix hypothesis. If you fire up a computer game, it's in a way like a Big Bang. You have a boom, you fire up a computer game, and it's like creating a new space-time universe, and with its own laws of nature. And so this would still be a possibility, but of course you can ask, is it plausible, and use other kinds of reasoning Yeah, so my personal view, and also to be very clear, I don't believe in the matrix hypothesis. I think there is an intelligent agent outside of our space-time, which very much resonates with the classical conception of theism, of an intelligent, omnipotent, omniscient being outside of space and outside of time that can interfere or create space-time and interfere with space-time.
So yeah, science is actually a methodology, and it's really a subset of philosophy if you think about it. It's one way to gather evidence for your arguments, but as you start, as you say, asking these deeper questions, then you have to retreat to the philosophical presuppositions, assumptions,
Right.
and you start weighing truth and false values philosophically as much as evidentially, because it's not black and white. There's gray areas. In fact, I was talking with Francis Beckwith many years ago, and you know, the falsification idea. Well, it can't be falsified. And he goes, "What are you talking about?" He says, "How do you falsify Darwinism? Intelligent design, if Darwinism is science and can be falsified, that means intelligent design is the falsification of Darwinism and vice versa. They're in contradistinction to one another, at least the way the Neo-Darwinists hold it currently. So if intelligent design isn't science because it can't be falsified, then neither is Darwinism. They undercut each other's legs. And you mentioned, you know, the new book, both Signature and the Cell, and the God hypothesis.
Yeah,
We actually interviewed Stephen Meyer. I have two podcasts because it was like a 3-hour talk. It was a long talk, so we cut it into two podcasts, and I those are on this channel. We'll link to it as well if people want to see more. But that was a really interesting engagement, and it's as the evidence becomes more replete and as the issues become more clear, it becomes more and more difficult to determine. Now, you had in one of your articles noted there's 3 different kind of understandings of intelligent design. One is as an empirical method, one is as a scientific research program, and then one is as a explanatory hypothesis. These are distinctions in how ideas leveraged. I'm going to assume is that the point you were making?
It would basically relate to what you said. You have on the one side, you have the method, simply the methodological apparatus, which is basically neutral. You can use it to detect plagiarism in art, or you can use it to detect vote fraud in elections, or in archaeology, SETI, forensics, and so on. You can use it to check was the coronavirus natural phenomenon, or was it created in a lab in China or something. So that is just the method, and I think it's an uncontroversial method. It only becomes controversial when you use it in a certain area where you have this kind of thinking blockade, where it's a no-go. You may not use this method here because it's not allowed, because it contradicts the current paradigm. The other would be when you have used this method and you have come to a conclusion, then of course you have a kind of inference to the best explanation. Is intelligent design true? Is there evidence for intelligent design? And is intelligent design the best explanation for the total evidence? And I would say yes. So I would not only affirm that intelligent design is a reasonable and uncontroversial and valid scientific method, an purely empirical method, which has nothing to do with religion. But I would also make a claim that it arrives at a conclusion if it is used on, let's say, cosmology or historical biology, that prefers intelligent design as a better explanation than unguided evolution.
Okay, that's great. So let me ask you, as we're getting ready to wrap up here, a couple of questions. First of all, what's on the horizon? What is exciting that's out there that maybe we've not heard about yet in this whole understanding of evolution and intelligent design? What's kind of coming down the way that we've not yet seen or we should be paying attention to in the future?
Yeah, so I think if you refer to, let's say, what will ultimately maybe bring what you indicated, this kind of paradigm change, as it was called by Kuhn, I think it will not come from biology, because biology is, for one reason or the other, more or less caught in this kind of 19th century thinking, clockwork universe thinking. Has not even made the jump to 20th century physics, which of course has dispensed with a lot of these mechanistic, materialistic ideas. So I think it's relatively unlikely that biologies will be the forerunners of a paradigm change in terms of giving up this materialist view. I think this change will rather come from theoretical physics and questions like, what is the relation of math to the laws of nature and to physics, and what do we make of this recent growing consensus that space-time is emergent from entangled quantum information, which rules out all kind of materialist explanation, because matter, energy, all happens within the arena of space-time. And if space-time is not fundamental but emergent from something else, then it's basically game over for materialism, and you need something transcendent. Whatever it is, you could say it's a Platonist mathematical heaven that let the laws of nature emerge, but you cannot have it in a kind of material way. You need something beyond space-time to make space-time emerge. So I think this will be one of the most interesting fields. Will be these modern areas of search for a fundamental theory of physics, finding a unified theory, field theories, digital physics, even these arguments from the simulation hypothesis, because you could, of course, even from a, let's say, metaphysical point of view, still question, is this simulation a simulation in a crude way, in a kind of giant supercomputer, or is it a simulation in a mind? Is a mind running the simulation inside itself? So I think there are useful arguments and new arguments, interesting new arguments coming from this kind of theoretical thought, also from philosophical fields that are related to these questions. This whole question of let's say, observer selection effects, which question the multiverse explanation, because in a multiverse where everything that can happen, in fact, does happen, and happen infinite number of times, then it leads to a breakdown of all rational reasoning. So there's a lot of things coming from there. If you would ask me in terms of biology and paleontology, I think there is still interesting stuff to be expected from more looks into genetics and evo-devo, where we more and more find out that this old view that you have a correspondence from gene to phene, that there is simply the DNA is a kind of computer code that codes for the organism, that this is not true. The DNA just codes for proteins. And a lot of the blueprint, how to make this organism, is either hidden in what was previously called junk DNA, and which more and more turns out to be a kind of operating system to switch on and switch off these coding regions in a certain coordinated way, which more and more reveals computer-like, software-like patterns, like certain ways to redundantly store information, error correction codes, and so on, where we have these design patterns embedded into the coding of life. There are interesting developments to expect from this. Also from the fossil record, I think the more we look into the fossil record, to me it looks like these problems of abrupt appearances and of discontinuities are getting more and more acute, and they should dissolve. If this is an artifact from an incomplete fossil record, you should expect, since Darwin, 150 years or 160 years of paleontological research, that these gaps, if they were just based on gaps of knowledge, should be getting smaller and smaller, and they are not. The number of problems has inflated much beyond what Darwin would have dreamed in his worst nightmares that could conflict with his theory. And then we have, of course, these new arguments like the waiting time problem that we're currently working on. I have some new ideas, one that I published in 2 articles on evolution use with the species pair challenge, which is still unmet. There were some attempts to meet this problem that we can show if we look at molecular datings of the branching events of recent pairs of any kind of species. You could compare 2 finches, but you could also compare a finch to a sunflower and look when did they separate based on molecular clock datings. And if you look at all kinds of species pair that have a separation that is similar, let's say, to the separation of Basilosaurus and Pachycetus on this, let's say, 4 to 10 million years time frame, what you find everywhere, and there are data banks with 10,000s of organisms. There's a data bank on the internet that you can just use yourself. It's called timetree.org. You enter 2 names. Let's say you compare a cat with a sparrow, and it shows you 2 dozen of studies with a consensus on a certain age where they separated. You don't find any kind of species pair that has a comparable morphological disparity on a similar time frame as Pachycetus and Basilosaurus, where you get, let's say, from a pig to a whale-like organism. If you look at recent organisms which have separated 5 million years ago, you have 2 different finches that look basically indistinguishable. If you compare, for example, a tree sparrow and a house sparrow, which still look extremely similar, they have separated between 15 or 20 million years ago. So 2 to 4 times the time that were available to make this pig to whale transition. So this is I think, interesting new argument, and I put out this challenge to come up with any example. Show me some recent argument of millions of species. There should be one example that shows, based on molecular clock dating, that this morphological transition is possible on this time frame, and there is no example. And the other argument I'm currently working on, which is showing that what I've already indicated, that these trees, if you calculate these common denominators, tend to collapse. There's, of course, some structure preserved. If you would take, let's say, the whole realm of life, you would still have mammals, and you would still have animals and plants and fungi, and you would still have cats and dogs. What you basically would preserve, which would survive this kind of collapse of the conflicting trees, is the old Linnaean categories. Which was pre-Darwinian, the pre-Darwinian systematic, the creationist systematic of Linnaeus. That would survive this comparison, but all the modern phylogenetic trees, these connections between the different families and orders, would collapse into polytomies. And this is also something that shows that something is wrong with this whole picture.
Fascinating. Yeah, lots of things going on, and it's exciting. I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask this question, because I have a paleoentomologist at my ready. Jurassic Park, the mosquito in the amber. I mean, everybody wants to know this, right? Well, they're currently working on resurrecting the woolly mammoth. I'm sure you're familiar with that project, where they're going to impregnate an Asian elephant, and but that's not a very big move, right? That's not a very big move. But tell me about how many mosquitoes are in amber? How are insects preserved in the fossil record? And I gotta hear this. Yes.
It's an easy question. It requires a little bit more complex answer, because it depends. So we do have mosquitoes in amber, and they are, at least from superficial look, very well preserved. So you can see every hair, you can see the single eyes of the compound eyes, and so on. So they look like a modern mosquito put into alcohol under a microscope. And we do have mosquitoes from amber that is from an age where dinosaurs were still around. So, for example, the amber from Myanmar, from Burma, has a calculated age, because there were volcanic layers above and below the amber. bearing sediments, we can frame it about 99 million years. So that would be a time where dinosaurs and pterosaurs were still around, and we have mosquitoes, blood-sucking insects preserved in this kind of amber. Now, one problem is that in most amber, these superficially very well preserved insects are just hollow casts. So you have the outside preserved and it's reflecting the light and you can see every detail, but inside there's nothing. So it's just a hollow kind of mold of the insect, but there's no organic substance inside. But there are certain types of amber where you have organic matter preserved, and in Burmese amber there is organic matter preserved, but it's basically turned into a coal-like substance and there's no DNA there. There have been some studies published in the mainstream literature, which was this kind of inspiration for the Jurassic Park story by Crichton, who claimed to have isolated DNA from amber insect. It was mostly Dominican amber, which is not that old. It's just about 15 million years old. But all these instances turned out to be contaminations and were not real DNA preserved in amber. We don't know any kind of true fossilized DNA that is older than some 100,000 years. That's about the oldest we get. So we have the Neanderthal genome. We have even from Homo heidelbergensis some genetic data. There has recently been claimed that there is at least preserved parts of DNA, not that you have the sequences, but remnants of the DNA in cells from soft tissue preserved dinosaurs, which would be quite remarkable, and that would be one of the arguments from the young earthers, where I would say, well, that's at least not nonsense at the first view. It's an argument that requires, it's an evidence that requires an explanation, and we don't know currently a really plausible and demonstrable explanation how these soft tissues could be preserved in dinosaurs that lived 100 million years ago. But there is no DNA sequence there. So in practice, we don't have DNA from the age of dinosaurs. So Jurassic Park will only be realized in computer games and maybe on the holodeck of the Enterprise.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I'm sure that was something on the back of everyone's minds that we'd have to think. Well, thank you, Dr. Beckley, for your time. This has been a wonderful time to catch up. There's so much here. The field continues to grow, obviously. Intelligent design has moved really quite a bit, even against the protestations of its detractors, and it's becoming more and more viable as other explanations just simply seem to fall apart. So I think it's a fascinating field. I wish you all the best in this, and I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Right, thanks. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.